Okay, good evening, everybody. I think I got a microphone on there. Y'all hear me? Loud enough voice anyway. Good evening, welcome, welcome, welcome. We want to welcome all of you here for 2023 Sacred Trust, July 3rd, our last event for Sacred Trust this evening, and we're going to go out with a big bang, that's for sure. I think everybody knows me. I'm Wayne Motts. It's my honor and pleasure to be the President and Chief Executive Officer here at the Gettysburg Foundation, the Parks Chief Partner here. I want to thank Steve Sims, the Superintendent of Gettysburg National Military Park. Chris Quinn, take a bow back in the back there, who's the Chief of Interpretation, Education here at Gettysburg. Chris and his whole team have been out on the battlefield most of the day doing all those programs, and we've been here doing the programs related to Sacred Trust. So to introduce our speaker, I'm going to introduce a woman who needs no introduction because she's done everything and been everywhere, but she is our chair of the Education Committee, and that is Dr. Carol Reardon. So please welcome Dr. Carol Reardon.
As usual. It's part of my shtick. I got to do it. So there you go. In addition to thanking Chris Quinn and the staff of the National Park Service, I think we owe a special shout out as well to the very efficient staff of the Gettysburg Foundation for everything that they did to make these last couple of days a success. So big round of applause. Now, evidence of their efficiency, they provided each of us who had introduction duties with a script. I've known our speaker for 33 years at least. I don't really need a script. I have so many stories. I know where so many bodies are buried. We don't need him to speak. I can take up the evening right here. And then it dawned on me. He's known me for 33 years. He has stories. He knows where bodies are buried. And so I want to thank the Gettysburg Foundation staff for giving me the opportunity to maintain decorum and professionalism by handing me a script from which to read. And it says here that this evening's speaker is Dr. Gary Gallagher, and his title is Bruce Catton and the Army of the Potomac Trilogy. Now, how many of us in here cut our eye teeth on the Civil War by reading Bruce Catton? Okay, look at those hands right there. If it wasn't that, it was probably the American Heritage Book of the Civil War, and people are nodding at that one too. So we're tracking in a very scary way right now. Dr. Gallagher will address the trilogy. Remember, that's Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, which was the first one I read, and A Stillness at Appomattox. And as the author of that new one-volume unabridged edition that he'll gladly sign for you, he's been able to, he'll be telling us more about Catton's background, his surpassing narrative skill, and many reasons these books, now 70 years old, deserve attention from anyone interested in the most compelling episode in United States history. Whoever writes these intros gets a big plus, because that's pretty much what I would have said. Dr. Gallagher really doesn't need any introduction either, but he is the George L. Now III Professor of History Emeritus from the University of Virginia, a position he took up after he defected from Penn State. He has written or edited over 40 books, which almost everybody in this room has, either all of them or most of them. We know we do, right? Okay. One of the things about academic historians is that we're really good at talking the talk, but we aren't always good at walking the walk when it comes down to things like battlefield preservation. We can tell you all about what happened here, but you don't find too many of us who are out in the forefront of actually trying to save them and preserve them and make them accessible to every one of us who's in this room tonight. Dr. Gallagher was one of those who was in the room to be one of the co-founders of the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, the predecessor of today's American Battlefield Trust. He's been in it from the start, and in addition to all the scholarship he's given us so much more in the field of preservation that let's give him a massive round of applause.
Thank both of you. I wondered whether Carol would blink first or I would, and she decided that she shortened my talk because I don't need to tell you now some of the very best stories about Carol. That can happen later. I am delighted to be here. I was very happy when I got the summons from Wayne to come and participate in the events. And it is a summons. When you get a call from Wayne, you just say yes and then change your calendar, and that's what I did. That's what I did in this instance, and so here we are at the end of this year's 3-year extravaganza relating to the Battle of Gettysburg. I'll give you a heads up right now. What you see up there is the entire amount of PowerPoints you're going to get during my talk tonight. This is sort of venturesome for me. In fact, I usually don't have anything there, and the only good thing about it is that if you do get bored, over the next 45 minutes, you have some text up there, and you, to yourself, can figure out how many other words you can make out of the letters that are there. It's a good way to pass the time if you have to. It's always fun to be asked to talk about one of your books. We all do that. Carol's done it many times, especially before an audience that obviously is made up of voracious readers, which this one is. But we're typically asked to talk about our own books. Tonight I'm going to depart from that a little bit because I'm going to be discussing an earlier historian whose work stands out among the untold thousands of books that have been published about the American Civil War. There are wires all over the place up here. I'm just going to reorient a few of them. Shadows, wires, everything. I'm going to put my cards on the table right at the beginning. Bruce Catton, more than any other historian or writer, is the reason I made my professional career studying and writing and teaching about the Civil War. As an 11-year-old, I purchased a copy of the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War, which was published in 1960, just before the beginning of the centennial commemoration, and won a special citation from the Pulitzer Prize Committee. Catton wrote the text for that book. And his graceful narrative, together with an array of memorable images, absolutely captivated me. I read and reread the book, poring over the bird's eye view maps that David Greenspan prepared, and virtually committing to memory long sections of Catton's text. I literally wore my first copy out and purchased a second, sort of archival copy, a 2-volume deluxe boxed edition in maroon buckram, which I still have in my library. That even survived. I moved from my house to a condo, sold 4,000 Civil War books to make the move, kept 1,500, and one of the 1,500 I kept is the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War. By the time I read that book, although I didn't know it, Catton had already introduced readers of the post-World War II era to a renowned American army from a previous epoch. Writing in the 1950s, he published 3 books, you all know this, about the Army of the Potomac that pulled readers into a transformative 19th century conflict featuring famous generals, storied campaigns, and most movingly, citizen soldiers whose stalwart effort saved the Republic at its moment of greatest peril. Mr. Lincoln's Army in 1951, Glory Road in 1952, and A Stillness in Appomattox in 1953. The third of them won the Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. They propelled Catton to the front rank of historians who wrote about the Civil War for a popular audience. He went on to deploy his surpassing gifts as a literary stylist and his sharp analytical skills to produce a number of other books after he wrote his Army of the Potomac trilogy. These came out between the mid-1950s and the mid-1970s. And near the end of his life, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the citation for which accurately described him as a man of letters and the preeminent historian of the Civil War. The Army of the Potomac trilogy, despite its age, remains a remarkable vehicle to introduce new generations of readers to a superb writer whose works illuminate the past in memorable fashion. The roots of Catton's trilogy can be found in a boyhood that brought him into contact with veterans who had fought for the Union. He was born in 1899. He spent his formative years in Benzonia, Michigan, a village of fewer than 600 residents that's just a little ways inland from the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. The Civil War veterans were men set apart, recalled Catton in his 1972 memoir, Benzonia's residents, he observed, considered the veterans pillars of the community, the keepers of our patriotic traditions, the living embodiment, so to speak, of what it most deeply believed about the nation's greatness, and high destiny. The small boys in the village, continued Catton, looked at the old soldiers in awe. Those terrible names out of the history books, Shiloh, Gettysburg, Stones River, Cold Harbor, those names came alive through these men. They had been there, he wrote. Later, as Catton entered Oberlin College while World War I raged in Europe, his view of the old soldiers became more complicated. News of the slaughter on the Western Front, he recalled, did something to my attitude. Verdun was beyond them. It became clear suddenly that our gallant old Civil War soldiers had simply been left behind by time. They had been part of the present for half a century, but now they unmistakably belong to the past. Catton left Oberlin to join the Navy in 1917, served as a gunner's mate without seeing combat, and after a second short stint at Oberlin, tried Oberlin twice and left both times, he pursued a career as a journalist. He worked as a reporter for the Cleveland News, later for the Boston American, and then the Cleveland Plain Dealer. In 1925, he joined the Scripps Howard Newspaper Enterprise Association, which was a syndication service in Cleveland. In 1939, he transferred to the NEA's office in Washington, where he began to write a syndicated column. His first Civil War writings came out from the Plain Dealer in 1923, when he wrote a series of short, unsigned articles about local Union veterans, and he titled the overall series, The Fading Blue Line. At the outset of World War II, Catton took up the first of a series of positions that he held with the federal government. As a press officer at the Office for Emergency Management and later as Director of Information for the War Production Board, he observed complicated bureaucratic infighting and the web of civilian and military factors that went into marshaling and allocating war-related sources. He remained in Washington after the war ended, holding public information posts in the Departments of Commerce and the Interior. He drew on his World War II experiences to publish in October 1948, The Warlords of Washington, a book that, according to one reviewer, illuminated interdepartmental feuds, personality clashes, confusions of authority, and other aspects of wartime production. And I think I just lost this is supposed to give me 1 minute. I'm going to do a little repair here. I've done a little repair there. How many words did you make? I can get law, raw, craw. There are a lot that come right to mind there. Well, the Warlords of Washington achieved little commercial success. Nonetheless, Catton, who was then nearing 50 years of age, decided to leave the government and become a full-time writer of history. He first contemplated writing a novel about Major General George Brinton McClellan, Little Jorge as I like to call him, but he soon abandoned the project to focus on a nonfiction study of the Army of the Potomac. He'd been immersing himself in materials relating to the Civil War, including regimental histories. He's one of the first really to be that interested in regimental histories, books that were written by and for members of Union units. These regimentals, which often included excerpts from letters and diaries from the war, had appeared in large numbers between the late 1860s and the early 20th centuries, and in their pages, Catton found echoes of what he had heard in listening to the veterans in Benzonia. He also likely had in mind, as he began his project, the recent work of Douglas Southall Freeman, a Pulitzer Prize winner whose Lee's Lieutenants, A Study in Command, had appeared between 1942 and 1944 in 3 large volumes chronicling the history of the high command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Catton admired Freeman. In an obituary he wrote for Freeman in 1953, Catton described the Virginian as a historian who, quote, did his job superlatively well. Preeminently a treatment of the rebel high command, Freeman's trilogy, noted Catton, also rendered the common soldiers who fought against the Army of the Potomac alive and believable and wholly fascinating. In time, these two men, Catton and Freeman, would be linked as exemplifying the best of historical writing, and they were that certainly to me as a boy in southern Colorado reading books about the Civil War. Once committed to his project, Catton worked very efficiently, no doubt helped by his long habit of meeting journalistic deadlines. It took him approximately 4 years of research and writing to yield the trilogy's 1,050 pages of text and 70 pages of notes. His sources included the regimental histories, which I've already talked about, a limited number, really limited number of unpublished manuscripts, published sets of letters, memoirs, diaries, and other participants' accounts as they existed in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and the secondary literature as it stood at mid-20th century. And that literature was minuscule compared to what we have now. For example, there wasn't a single book yet, scholarly book, that had been published on black soldiers when Catton prepared his books on the Army of the Potomac. Dudley T. Cornish's The Sable Arm, Negro Troops in the Union Army, 1861 to 1865, didn't appear until several years after Catton had finished his trilogy. He relied most heavily, as he acknowledged in A Stillness at Appomattox, on the invaluable The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. We all know these 127 thick books jammed with correspondence and reports and other documents. There's also a 128th volume that's the index and a separate atlas. They're sort of the mother lode of published primary materials on the military side of the war. Because he wrote for a general audience, Catton didn't employ the type of rigorous citation characteristic of monographic literature that come from academics. And he wrote, "No attempt has been made to cite the authority for every statement of fact." He wrote this in Mr. Lincoln's Army. He said, "But it is advisable to list the sources for direct quotations and to give at least a general indication of the works which have been principally drawn on for each chapter." And I would say to all of you that you should pay attention to these notes. They're located at the back of the book rather than at the bottom of the page, as they are in many monographs. They're easy to ignore, but the trilogy's notes contain a good deal of engaging material that enhances the narrative. One of the notes for a chapter in Mr. Lincoln's Army contains a pair of useful and memorably worded observations about the battles outside Richmond in the late spring and early summer of 1862, the Peninsula and the 7 Days. An odd and frequently overlooked fact about the fighting on the Peninsula, observed Catton, is that in no single battle was anything like the whole strength of the Army of the Potomac put into action. The climactic struggle of Gaines's Mill was, for most of the soldiers, simply offstage noises. In this regard, with what I can imagine is a twinkle in his authorial eye, Catton added, "McClellan himself was not much better off than the man in the ranks. A study of his letters and telegrams unmistakably depicts a man who never quite knew what was going on." Catton's attempt to place the first volume of the trilogy with a publisher proved frustrating for him. Books on the Civil War didn't sell well in 1950, and 3 prominent publishing houses turned him down. Before Doubleday, acting in part on advice from the notable New York bookman George Braziller, offered him a contract. Because sales of Mr. Lincoln's Army and Glory Road only amounted to about 2,000 copies each, Doubleday really considered dropping the trilogy before Catton finished it. But he successfully pressed his case for completing the project, and A Stillness at Appomattox appeared. But it, like the preceding 2 volumes, was only marginally successful. These sluggish sales could not be attributed to negative reviews. The reviews were very strong. Henry Steele Commager, who was a leading historian and public intellectual, wrote in the New York Herald Tribune's book review of Mr. Lincoln's Army that it's, quote, "one of the most exciting war narratives in our literature." And of Glory Road, Commager said, "a splendid achievement, historical and literary." In the New York Times, Orville Prescott, who was the newspaper's principal book reviewer, pronounced A Stillness at Appomattox, quote, "the best written and most interesting historical work about the Civil War I've ever read." Now, he didn't tell readers how many he'd actually read, but however many that was, Catton's was the best. Maybe it was the best of all 3 that he'd ever read. Who knows? Historian Belle I. Wiley whose The Life of Johnny Reb had been published in 1943 and had pioneered the study of common soldiers, termed Catton's third volume, quote, a magnificent piece of writing that includes passages with the grandeur and beauty of poetry. The notice in Time magazine, I'll stop after this, similarly lauded the narrative grace evident in all three volumes. Catton has spent 3 years making the Civil War sound as fresh and exciting as if it had been fought yesterday. Well, unexpected news in May 1954 changed the picture entirely for Catton and his trilogy. He was invited to appear on the Today Show, NBC's Today Show. And while he was on the show, he learned that A Stillness at Appomattox had won the Pulitzer Prize. His editors hadn't told him, who were at Doubleday. I would have pressed for new editors at that point. And as he put it, the prize not only opened doors that otherwise would have been closed to me, but somehow gave me the courage to keep on going and more or less confirmed in me my notion that the kind of work I was doing was worthwhile. All three titles in the trilogy began to sell much better and eventually reached hundreds of thousands of readers in both regular editions and in book club editions. All of this happening as the Civil War centennial of 1961 approached. My own set of the trilogy came via a Book of the Month Club dividend my mother earned with other purchases. I still have that set in their funny little dust jackets. They're cheaper book club editions, but I cherish them. Stephen W. Sears, as a young man, worked with Bruce Catton. He's a widely read Sears, of course, as you all know, widely read and respected historian. He perceptively commented about the Army of the Potomac trilogy's long-term influence. It was Catton's work, suggested Sears, not quite 50 years after publication of Mr. Lincoln's Army, that stimulated interest among general readers in every aspect of the war and and enhanced the market for all concerned during the Civil War centennial period. The trilogy, thought Sears, triggered a Civil War boom that lasted several decades. Commemorative anniversaries, Ken Burns' documentary, and other literary, cinematic, and cultural factors all boosted interest in the conflict at various times, but the foundational importance of those three books on the Army of the Potomac cannot be gainsaid. My own experience with groups of Civil War enthusiasts, including here tonight before this talk, bears out Sears' assertion about Catton's importance. Countless members of audiences have told me in question and answer periods following talks, during book signings, or in more private settings, that reading one of Catton's books is what brought them to their interest in the Civil War. And of course, that was my own experience as well. Several attributes explain both the trilogy's success and why it deserves continuing attention. Most obviously, the quality of writing sets Catton apart. After almost 3/4 of a century, he remains unexcelled as a stylist among historians who have written about the Civil War. A lecture delivered to the Society of American Historians titled History as Literature afforded Catton an opportunity to identify what made possible his own success. Clarity of expression is what you must have to start with, he said. Put on top of that any flourishes you like. You must begin with the ability to say what you mean in a way that other people can understand. Those words should be chiseled in the break room of every academic department of history in the United States. People should be made to look at them and actually think about writing in a way that people might want to read something that you've written. That's a little aside. I'm now going to move on. Now, clarity of expression, he continued, which is at the basis of all literary achievement, depends on clarity of thinking. If you can think clearly, you may be able to write clearly. Otherwise, not. The Army of the Potomac trilogy includes a few unsuccessful rhetorical flourishes, to borrow Catton's word, but overall it carries readers along with prose both admirably precise and often beautifully evocative. Catton excelled at brief biographical portraits that distilled the essence of characters into a few memorable sentences. With George B. McClellan, for example, he offered a superb reading of the general's letters to his poor wife, Ellen. Just imagine being Ellen McClellan. If only A.P. Hill hadn't had that problem, she probably would have married him. So this is Catton's take on McClellan. He was young for a conquering hero, observed Catton of the 35-year-old commander who built the Army of the Potomac, and it was only natural that he himself should have been impressed by his own eminence. But in going through the correspondence, added Catton, one presently begins to find something more than the natural blinking of a man who's dazzled by his own good fortune. There's too much lingering on the adoration other men feel for him, on the wild enthusiasm he arouses, on the limitless power and responsibility that are his. Catton closed with a question that raises the specter of McClellan's failures at moments of decision. What buried sense of personal inadequacy was gnawing at this man that he had to see himself so constantly through the eyes of men and women who looked upon him as a hero out of legend and myth? He nails George B. McClellan, and he does it in one paragraph. A 6-page portrait of U.S. Grant in A Stillness at Appomattox bristles with insights about the Union's preeminent soldier. Ulysses S. Grant was a natural, wrote Catton of the new general-in-chief who would accompany the Army of the Potomac in the spring 1864 campaigns, an unmistakable Middle Westerner, bearing somehow the air of the little farm and the empty, dusty road and the small-town harness shop, plunked down here in an army predominantly officered by polished Easterners. The level of expectation for Grant, Catton reminded readers, was staggering. He was under great pressure. Hopes and fears centered on him, not to mention jealousies. The country at large believed he was the man who was at last going to win the war, and possibly very quickly. He was, continued Catton, a man infinitely more complex than most people could realize. Under the hard, ruthless man of war, the remorseless soldier who hammered and hammered until men foolishly believed him raw strength incarnate, was quite another person. We all know that Grant had experienced failure. We know that he sometimes harbored doubts. But Catton highlighted Grant's key attribute, one that the general's great friend William Tecumseh Sherman also described. There was a flame in him, and there were times when he could not keep the winds from the outer dark from blowing in on him and making it flicker, but it never did go out. An ability to set the stage for dramatic action suffuses all three books. Catton allocated a good deal of attention to the Iron Brigade, perhaps the most famous unit in the Army of the Potomac, which comprised 5 Midwestern regiments, including one from Catton's own home state of Michigan. He ushered its soldiers onto the stage at Gettysburg in a paragraph, it's my favorite paragraph in all of Bruce Catton, that captured the men's sense of themselves, the escalating action on the morning of July 1st, 1863, and what the day's fighting would mean for the unit. The Westerners fell into step and came swinging up the road, he began, their black hats tilted down over their eyes, rifle barrels sparkling in the morning sun. There were 1,800 fighting men in this brigade, and the men were cocky. Officially, they were the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Army Corps, and they figured that if the Army were ever drawn up in one long line for inspection, they would stand on the extreme right of it, which somehow was cause for pride. As they ascended Seminary Ridge, the men could hear a battle developing to their front. And here I will return to Catton. On the ridge to the west, there was a crackle of small arms fire and a steady crashing of cannon, with a long, soiled cloud of smoke drifting up in the still morning air. And at the head of the column, the drums and the fifes were loud, playing The Girl I Left Behind Me, probably, the perennial theme song of the Army of the Potomac, playing the Iron Brigade into its last great fight. Readers soon learned that roughly 2/3 of those 1,800 men became casualties on July the 1st at Gettysburg, a toll that ended the Iron Brigade's ability to function as a major presence on a Civil War battlefield. The trilogy also displays an impressive breadth of coverage. At first glance, a military study of one army, the volumes in fact integrate political, social, and martial history in a way that conveys a remarkable and full portrait of the loyal citizenry of the United States at war. Catton spoke to this point in a series of lectures at Wesleyan University that were published in 1958 as a little book called America Goes to War, noting that the Civil War, quote, has become preeminently a military narrative that examines precisely what happened and why it happened on every field of battle. Catton insisted that a conflict defined that narrowly, quote, would not be worth much continued study. With some of his World War II experiences likely in mind, he argued that the Civil War, quote, is clearly worth a great deal of re-examination because it shows how the American people made their democracy work in a time of most extraordinary trial and complexity. In dealing with the military campaigns, the selection of generals, the choice of strategic objectives, and all the rest, the Northern leaders never once forgot that what they really had on their hands was a political problem. What an insight. Catton's sensitivity throughout the trilogy to the reciprocal relationship between military affairs and politics created a leitmotif through the whole series. It's present evidenced when he dealt in Mr. Lincoln's Army with the meaning of the Battle of Antietam. Everybody in here knows everything about Antietam. Fought to a tactical draw on September 17, 1862 at a cost of about 23,000 casualties. The climactic engagement of Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the United States afforded Lincoln the opportunity 5 days later, on the 22nd, to issue his preliminary proclamation of emancipation. Now the war, said Catton, would be fought to the bitter end. The deep, tangled issues underneath the war, slavery, the permanence of the Union, the dawning concept that a powerful central government might protect the people's freedom rather than endanger it. All of these now must be settled, not evaded, and settled by violence, violence having been unleashed. Non-military topics that Catton wove into his narrative included, among many others, the presidential election of 1864, political maneuvering in Washington, the rise of the Copperheads within the Democratic Party, labor violence in the anthracite coal regions of Pennsylvania, anti-conscription activities, and attitudes toward African Americans among the loyal white citizenry. However effective the trilogy's integration of non-military aspects of the war, however, Catton's exploration of common soldiers formed the core of his narrative. The opening sentence of a preface he wrote for a reissue of Mr. Lincoln's Army in 1962 signaled his focus. The books which make up this trilogy began very simply as an attempt to understand the men who fought in the Army of the Potomac. Catton recalled his youthful hero worship of veterans who seemed to have been caught up, quote, in a romantic business. But that notion, as he matured, gave way to the realization, quote, that this picture was somewhat out of focus. War, obviously, is the least romantic of all man's activities, and it contains elements which the veterans do not describe to children. In a sense, the research that went into these books was simply an effort to find out about the things which the veterans never discussed. Telling the soldier's story opened the way to work on a larger historical canvas because, as Catton put it, the war in which they fought did settle something for us, or incredibly started something which we ourselves have got to finish. It was not only the biggest experience in their own lives, it was in a way the biggest experience in our life as a nation. And that unfinished business, as became clear as the trilogy unfolded, was the promise of emancipation. Catton anticipated a later flowering of scholarship on common soldiers. We are awash in scholarship on common soldiers. You can have a very long bookshelf of books with that focus. But together with Bell Wiley's Life of Johnny Reb, which I already mentioned, from 1943, and Wiley's Life of Billy Yank, which came out in 1952, the same year as Glory Road, the Army of the Potomac trilogy marked a striking change in a field long dominated by attention to celebrated generals and how they had managed battles. Catton's books eventually reached far more readers than Wiley's, making him, in my view, rather than his able contemporary, the critical figure in this interpretive shift of lens from the upper echelons of command to the views from the ranks. Anyone who reads the trilogy will have learned a great deal about recruitment, about life in camp and on the march, about reactions to battle, about medical care, about desertion, about tensions between the true volunteers of 1861-62 and the men who received bounties for volunteering after the passage of the Conscription Act of 1863, about attitudes within the ranks toward Army commanders and other officers, about enmity toward anti-war elements of the loyal population, and about the challenge of bringing African American soldiers into Union service. Black soldiers play only a minor role in Catton's trilogy, as they did in most of the Army of the Potomac's history. No United States Colored Troops units, USCT units, served with the Army until 1864. The Army waged its most celebrated battles, therefore, with no black men in the ranks. These battles included the 7 Days and Second Bull Run, and Antietam and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, and really the Wilderness and Spotsylvania if you're talking about troops actually going into combat. The first serious combat for USCT soldiers came in the assaults at Petersburg on June 15, 1864, and their most famous engagements in the Army of the Potomac's theater included the Crater in late July, Newmarket Heights in late September. A number of the men there won medals of honor, as many of you know, and finally the Appomattox campaign. Catton didn't sugarcoat white soldiers' attitudes toward their black comrades. The average northern white man of that era might refuse to associate with the Negro and hold himself to be immeasurably the Negro's superior, wrote Catton, but there was a war on. The country needed soldiers, and if federal corpses were the price of victory, it hardly paid to be finicky about the original color of the corpses' skins. Beyond that baseline of prejudice, Catton added, the real trouble lay in the assumption that while it was all right to let the Negro get shot, it was foolish to expect him to do any serious fighting first. Catton described rebel soldiers' fury when they encountered USCT men at the Crater, as well as the black soldiers' impulse, fueled by knowledge of what had happened at Fort Pillow, Tennessee in April 1864, to shoot Confederate prisoners on the spot. The appearance of USCT units in the spring and summer of 1864 figured in a fundamental shift, argued Catton, quote, which was indeed a good deal more complex than most of the participants were able to understand. It went beyond the casualties, beyond the grinding physical and emotional toll of day-to-day carnage during the Overland campaign, and I'll come back to Catton now. The war had taken on a new magnitude, he insisted, and perhaps it was no longer the kind of struggle anybody could win, but it was moving inexorably toward its end, and when it ended, many things would end with it, in the South and in the North as well. Some of these things were things that ought to end because they shackled men to the past, and some of them were fit to be laid away in the shadowland of dreams that are remembered forever. But in any case, they were being brought to an end. After that, there could be a new beginning. The trilogy addressed the process of hardening among veterans and the increasing severity of the war. On that second theme, how the war became more severe, his passages about the Fredericksburg campaign in 1862 highlight the war's growing harshness. The day before the battle, which took place on December 13th, as all of you know, Union soldiers sacked the old colonial town in a spasm of wild destruction. The war was changing, wrote Catton, and reached a point now where the fighting of it turned loose some unpleasant emotional drives. It had become a war against, he italicized that, against slavery, against perhaps the men who owned slaves, by inevitable extension against that man and his family and his goods and chattels who, by living with the hated institution, seemed to have made war necessary, and who in any case were standing in the road when the Avengers came. 20 months after the firing on Fort Sumter, the conflict had reached a point where, in Catton's words, the people in Virginia had become aliens, and their land was strange and foreign, and therefore subject to hate. Books about an army necessarily included many descriptions of battles, and those parts of Catton's narrative convey a vivid and often disturbing immediacy. I'll quote from two. On May 12, 1864, the two armies contested for a small arc of Confederate breastworks at Spotsylvania. This was the bloody angle, readers learned about the second engagement of U.S. Grant and Robert E. Lee's Overland campaign. The place where a trench made a little bend and where the two armies might have clasped hands as they fought. And it was precisely here that the war came down to its darkest cockpit. The fighting was formless, monstrous. something no general could will. It grew out of what these men were and what the war had taught them. Cruel knowledge of killing, wild, brief contempt for death, furious, unspeakable ferocity that could transcend every limitation of whipped nerves and beaten flesh. The weather, Catton told readers, conspired to make things worse. As they grappled in the driving rain with the smoke and the wild shouting and the great shock of gunfire all about them, this one muddy ditch with a log wall running down the middle became the center of the whole world. Nothing mattered except to possess it utterly or to clog it breast high with corpses. There was no victory in all of this, and there was no defeat. There was just fighting, and it had become an end in itself. 20 hours of combat, readers learned shortly thereafter, brought no more than a slight realignment of the Union and Confederate positions in the Mule Shoe, and within days the two battered armies resumed their bloody progress toward Petersburg. My second example concerns action at Chancellorsville on the evening of May 2nd, 1863, where Catton memorably reconstructed the rapid collapse of Major General O.O. Howard's unsuspecting 11th Corps soldiers on the Union right flank. The sun was getting low, he wrote. Far away beyond the woods to the south, there was a muffled sound of musketry. Into a little clearing in front, innumerable deer had suddenly emerged from the woods to the west and were galloping madly toward the east, while the soldiers waved their hats and whooped. Then, as the deer scampered off into the underbrush, the quiet of the spring evening caved in with a stupendous crash. Out of the forest in the west, there came a handful of rifle shots, then the wild, weird falsetto of the rebel yell, followed by a great rolling volley of musketry. Catton then distilled into two sentences the moment of crisis for Howard's westernmost units as the weight of Stonewall Jackson's attack quickly settled the issue. Von Gilsa's skirmish line of two German regiments looked up to see all the rebels in the world shouldering their way through the tangle, firing their rifles and yelling like fiends. Their line extended far beyond the vision to right and left. The Germans got off a few hasty shots, and then the flood rolled over them. Abraham Lincoln described the Civil War in July 1861 as essentially a people's contest that would decide the fate of representative government. And later, here at Gettysburg, in his address in November 1863, he reminded listeners that the people most responsible for deciding the issue were the brave men, living and dead, who wore blue uniforms. Bruce Catton introduced readers to those soldiers as effectively as any historian. Inevitably a product of his time, he uses in the trilogy some outdated language, perhaps most obviously passages dealing with African-American soldiers, whom he described in then-current terms as Negro or colored troops. But linguistic anachronisms do not lessen the value of what Catton accomplished. Those who traverse his trilogy develop a better understanding of how the conflict played out and why the United States emerged triumphant. At the end, they share the soldier's perspective because Catton chose not to follow U.S. Grant and other Union officers into the McLean family's parlor at Appomattox Courthouse. He gave the readers the perspective of the soldiers who were watching those officers ride by. The little cavalcade went trotting along the road to the village, read the trilogy's penultimate sentence, and all around them the two armies waited in silence. As the generals neared the end of their ride, a Yankee band in a field near the town struck up Old Lang Syne, at the end of the trilogy. Catton's reputation as a Civil War historian grew steadily through the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. He published 3 excellent books about Grant, beginning with with U.S. Grant and the American military tradition, a slender volume released in 1954 that anticipated the direction scholarship on Grant has taken in the last 20 years. Grant moves south and Grant Takes Command, published in 1960 and 1969, respectively, finished Lloyd Lewis's trilogy that had begun in 1950 with Captain Sam Grant. His widow, Lloyd Lewis's widow, had asked specifically that Catton finish that trilogy. This Hallowed Ground, the story of the Union side of the Civil War, a 1956 title, was part of Doubleday's Mainstream of America series. Catton's impact during the centennial years, as I've already said, easily exceeded that of any other historian. Not even close, not even close. In 1960, readers, including me, on my family's farm in southern Colorado, as I already mentioned, devoured Catton's 60,000-word narrative for the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War. With an initial printing of 300,000 copies in the first year of the Civil War centennial, that book, that picture history of the war, achieved great commercial success. One reviewer echoed many others in stating, quote, "It would be difficult to find a better introduction to the Civil War than this sumptuous book." That was true in 1961. It's true in 2023. A second trilogy, The Centennial History of the Civil War, followed over the next 5 years. The Coming Fury in 1961, Terrible Swift Sword in 1962, and Never Call Retreat in 1965. I have read all of Bruce Catton's books. There's several I haven't mentioned, and I'm not going to, including his memoir titled Waiting for the Morning Train in American Boyhood, which, as the subtitle suggests, focused on Catton's years in Michigan before he went off to Oberlin. But I always come back to the Army of the Potomac trilogy. For me, it best reveals Catton's visceral connection to the Civil War. The key to understanding Catton lies with the blue-clad citizen soldiers who left Benzonia, Michigan, and countless other northern communities to don blue uniforms and shoulder muskets and offer their service and possibly their long-term health or lives to suppress the slaveholders' rebellion. They provide the narrative pulse for Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and A Stillness at Appomattox. No one has told their story with its manifold military, political, cultural, and human resonances better than Bruce Catton. And I'll close with a passage describing Union soldiers near Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, when they realized that Robert E. Lee would indeed surrender that day of April 9th, 1865. This is another surprising way that he handles this. This is what he says. All up and down the lines, the men blinked at one another, unable to realize that the hour they had waited for so long was actually at hand. It was Palm Sunday. They would all live to see Easter. And with the guns quieted, it might be easier to comprehend the mystery and the promise of that day. Yet the fact of peace and no more killing in an open road home seems to have been too big to grasp right at the moment. And in the enormous silence that lay upon the field, men remembered that they had marched far and were very tired, and they wondered when the wagon trains would come up with rations. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. We're so glad you answered that summons.
Couldn't say no.
Appreciate it very, very much. All right, now, before anybody leaves, I'm going to say thank you so much. We're going to whisk Gary back up to the signing table. If you do not have a copy of the Catton trilogy, you can get the edited volume that Dr. Gallagher has edited right out at the table. We've got a couple other of his publications out there too. So before you leave, if you don't have a copy of this, you just heard him give you all those great pieces of background, get yourself a copy. I want to say thanks once again, for all of you coming out to Gettysburg National Military Park here at the Visitor Center and being with us for the anniversary of the 160th for Gettysburg, being with us for Sacred Trust 2023. I want to reiterate what Carol said and thank the staff of the Gettysburg Foundation for all their hard work in organizing and preparing the place for the event that we had here. And once again, thanks to Chris Gwynn, the staff of the Gettysburg National Military Park, for all they've done over the anniversary weekend. Now, tomorrow, we return to what we call normal operations here at the Gettysburg National Military Park, and that means you can come and still avail yourselves of the programs that the Park Service is going to do out on the battlefield. You can come here to the Visitor Center, get your ticket to the film, the cyclorama, and the museum, and just be with us throughout the whole year. Come back many times is what we hope. If you're not a member of the Gettysburg Foundation, Friends of the National Parks of Gettysburg, help us preserve and educate people for Gettysburg. Help us do that. And you can join online, or if you're here tomorrow, you can go right out to the Friends desk, and somebody there, I guarantee you, will help sign you up. All right. Thank you so much. We hope you have a wonderful holiday.